Hello, and welcome to Economics and You. I'm your host, Mr. Samuelson. Today we're going to be looking at the benefits of global trade and why nations interact with each other to exchange goods. All right, before we get into this, we need to understand some basic terms: imports and exports. Imports are goods that you buy from other countries. So if the United States buys a good from China, it's an import because we're bringing it in from another country. And without imports, some goods are unavailable. And other goods are available, we can make them here, but they're just more expensive if we make them here. And so we import in order to get goods that we otherwise wouldn't be able to or would be too expensive. Exports are the reverse. Exports are goods that are made in one country and sold to another. For example, the United States might make General Motors cars and sell them to other nations throughout the world. We export those cars. So those are imports and exports. Now, why do we have this trade system? What are the benefits? Well, nations benefit from trade because we have different natural resources. We have different things here in the United States, both minerals in the ground and climate, and people, because people are a resource, than other countries around the world. So our exact mix of what we can produce and produce well is different from that in another country. Now, the factors of production all play a big role in this. The land, that is the resources, the labor, that is the people and their level of education, and of course the capital. How much investment in machines to build things do we already have? Now, the United States, we have a lot of capital, a whole lot of capital. We've got a lot of factories and a lot of expertise around building things. But we also have a very expensive labor force in the United States. So we have a kind of a competitive disadvantage in low-skilled labor, such as picking bananas. It would cost a lot to pay an American in the United States used to an American lifestyle to do that type of work. And so we don't do a lot of it. Now, nations with low capital but cheap labor can do this and can produce some goods, such as bananas, much more cheaply than we can in the United States. And so we don't grow a lot of bananas. We bring them in from other countries. Now, this leads to a good discussion on absolute advantage and, in a moment, comparative advantage. Now, a country has an absolute advantage in trade if they can produce more output per unit of input than another country. That is, if you can produce a whole bunch of airplanes and you've got really good at doing it and you can do it very cheaply compared to what it would take another nation to produce that airplane, then you have an absolute advantage. Inputs here are time and money. We have an expert workforce that can do this quickly, and we already have a lot invested in the capital to build airplanes, so we do this well, and we export a lot of airplanes. Now, for this reason, countries will specialize in the products which it has an absolute advantage in. If they're especially well set up with their climate and their labor and their existing capital to produce a particular product and produce it for a large profit, then they will do that. We see this with electronics in Japan. Japan has one heck of an electronics industry, and they're really well set up for it. The United States produces a lot of airplanes. And Central American countries produce a lot of bananas because they've got a great climate for producing bananas. And their workforce there is well accustomed to it. And every one of these nations does a lot of exporting of these goods. We produce far more than we would need as a nation. Looking at a graph to see how this looks, this would be a comparison between Ghana and South Korea, looking at two goods that each of them could make. Looking at cocoa and rice. Now, Ghana could produce, on our production possibilities curve, 15 units of cocoa if they devoted all of their resources to it, and 7 of rice if they devoted all of their resources. Now, if they needed both cocoa and rice, they would produce somewhere in the middle, and they'd have themselves 9 units of cocoa and 4 of rice. Now, South Korea's production possibilities curve looks very different. They could produce 5 units of cocoa, maybe even 4, or 17 of rice. They're much better at producing rice than they are at cocoa. So if these two nations were to trade with each other, they would want to make sure that Ghana is making more of the cocoa than rice, because South Korea can make rice a whole lot more cheaply than Ghana can, and both of them can benefit and produce the good that they have an absolute advantage in. Now, comparative advantage looks at things a little bit differently. Here, we're looking at nations that want to maximize their trade profits. All nations want to do this. They might have an absolute advantage in several products. Okay, we might have country A, which has an absolute advantage in cars and in bikes. Country A does both of these things better. But now they're engaged in trade with country B. Country B does almost as well with cars, but not very well at all with bikes. So if we were to divide up our labor, we would want to make sure that country A is building all of the bikes. Country B was wasting their time building bikes. So country A has an opportunity here to export a lot of bikes to country B, less opportunity to export cars, which gives B a comparative advantage there. They would want to build more cars as country A shifts their resources away from cars and toward bikes, where they have a stronger advantage. This is going to benefit both nations, as both nations, country A can't build 10 cars and 5 bikes. They have to divide up this labor one way or another. This is going to be where their better comparative advantage is. And then country B is going to be able to slide some cars in to make up for any gaps in production. This is the nation's comparative advantage in the less profitable products. Again, look at this on a graph. We would see, country A, production possibilities curve. It's able to build our unit on the X axis much better than the unit on the Y. Country B has an absolute advantage in both, but there's no strong leaning toward one product over another. So we would want to have country A building the product that they can build better. They're not good at this unit, axis Y. They're not good at it, so they're not going to make much of that. They're going to shift their production possibilities curve as far out here as they can. And to compensate for that, nation B is going to shift their production a little bit up toward this point so that it can benefit from trade with country A and maximize its profits, which country A can't do very well at all, by shifting its production up toward good number Y. To look at it another way, we'd look at the US and Canada. Okay, US is far better at producing apples than Canada is. We're also better at producing strawberries. But in the United States, every strawberry we produce costs us 4 apples. We have to make 4 less apples for every strawberry we produce. So why would we produce strawberries? We're so good at producing apples. So we shift all of our production over to apples, so Canada doesn't have to make any apples because they're really, really bad at making apples. So Canada drops this to 0. They put all of their production into strawberries, and we don't worry about paying that small difference to import the strawberries because we're making so much money on the apples. That's our opportunity cost playing into our comparative advantage. So opportunity costs. We do need to understand this one. Comparative advantage happens because of these opportunity costs. Remember that opportunity cost is the cost of missed opportunities and the loss of those benefits. So we don't want to miss the opportunity in our last scenario of producing apples. Producing a less profitable good costs time and money. You don't want to do it. If you have an option between apples and strawberries, the United States wants to make apples. So we make apples. We don't produce strawberries. This can allow nations to become more specialized in trade and more efficient. We make apples, Canada makes strawberries. In the whole, everybody works out to their advantage. That's how that works. Here's another UK-Australia thing. Hello, old chap. I simply can't afford to specialize in pears as my opportunity costs are too high. You seem to have a comparative advantage, though. Don't worry, mate. You produce the apples, and we'll produce the pears, as I have a lower opportunity cost. Sorry for my horrible accents, but that's the idea. Nations deciding who's going to produce what based upon their own opportunity costs. Thank you very much for joining me today and my horrible British and Australian accents. Hope you learned something. Other than that, I have horrible accents. And I'll see you again soon. Yeah.